Hello, everyone. I'm Tyrone Buckley, Assistant Deputy Director of Fair Housing at the Department of Housing and Community Development. I'd like to welcome you to HCD's webinar on affirmatively furthering fair housing, which will provide HCD guidance on AFFH and housing elements. This webinar is being recorded and will be available later on our website. The purpose of this webinar is to help you understand recent changes in California fair housing and HCD's vision for implementation. While the work of the department has always been deeply connected to addressing fair housing issues, our efforts have become much more intentionally focused on addressing racial equity and broadening access to opportunity with the passage of recent legislation, which we will discuss today. As you will see, we now have the opportunity to ensure that housing elements are infused with data and actions that will secure increased fair housing choice. In order to provide support, in addition to workshops like these, we released a detailed guidance on implementing the law in April. It was accompanied by an AFFH data viewer tool to provide access to data essential in understanding fair housing issues. Today's webinar will focus on the new requirements for fair housing elements included in that. This work is important, and HCD is excited that California has this opportunity to lead in fair housing. Work to achieve fair housing is at its core our country and our communities coming to terms with a difficult history. A history that includes legally sanctioned racism, xenophobia, and exclusion, all of which continues to leave its mark on our current system. That means that historical context is important to this work, particularly our history of inequality. This Saturday, many in our country will celebrate and recognize Juneteenth, a day in 1865 on which many Black people learned that they were no longer enslaved. It is important for us to remember that it was a little over 100 years later in 1968 that the Civil Rights Movement and the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King achieved the passage of the Fair Housing Act to make housing discrimination and the tools of segregation illegal. Much of what you will hear about today is modeled on the 2015 Obama rule on fair housing. This rule, which many believe to be our most earnest attempt to achieve the vision of the 1968 Fair Housing Act, came almost 50 years after its passage. And this is where we all come into the story. This is our legacy. This is why we are excited at HCD to do this important work and do what we can to achieve this long sought equity. And now it's my pleasure to introduce Gustavo Velasquez. Gustavo is the director at the California Department of Housing and Community Development. In May 2020, Gustavo came to us. He was appointed by Governor Gavin Newsom to be the director of the department, and we are pleased to have him. As the head of our department, Director Velasquez leads California's housing policy agenda and administers a wide range of programs that produce, preserve, and protect affordable housing in communities of opportunity across the state. Previously, Director Velasquez was senior director at the Urban Institute, a renowned national research organization working to provide data analysis and insights to policymakers and practitioners. But even more importantly to us as our director, his experience as for nearly 3 years as the Assistant Secretary for Fair Housing and Equal Opportunity at the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, otherwise known as HUD. He served on behalf of the President as the strategic lead of the Fair Housing and Inclusive Community Agenda for the Obama administration. During his tenure, HUD achieved groundbreaking enforcement victories in fair lending and in major housing discrimination cases. Director Velasquez led efforts to promulgate the landmark Affirmatively Furthering Fair Housing Rule, a key tool for cities, states, and other HUD funding recipients to reduce inequality and disparities in access to opportunity. We are pleased to have his breadth of experience and expertise at the helm as we advance this important work. And now I turn the floor over.
Thank you, Tyrone. Good morning, everyone. I am very excited this morning to be with you today to kick off this first public webinar on the guidelines to assist jurisdictions on their legal requirement and duty to affirmatively further fair housing in California. In the next hour, you're going to hear a lot about what AFFH can do for you and in your community. You will hear about strategies on how government and the public can come together to turn the concept of fair housing into a living, breathing part of the fabric of your community. And I mentioned this from the start, these guidelines And this webinar are not only for government officials and employees that have to plan for housing elements accordingly. It's for the public, it's for the community that should maintain an active role in participating in the public discourse about how AFFH can be achieved, informing the public debate. That's one of the most critical messages that I hope you can take from this. Another critical message I would like jurisdictions in particular to take from this is that you will learn that you are not alone if you haven't already. We are here at HCD to support you and help you succeed. Nobody wants to find jurisdictions out of compliance for their AB 686 obligations. So at HCD, we are decisively committed to providing you with the tools, such as the amazing data tool that the team here put together, along with technical assistance and ongoing communication so that we can help you set you up for success. Now, I don't have to tell you that affirmatively further fair housing is amongst the most important work that we can do as a state to reverse long-standing patterns of residential segregation. As Tyrone pointed out, if you know something about my career before coming to HCD, you will know this is one of my top priorities as director. And I frankly would not have come here if I had any doubt that we would not have the support of leadership to do this work and do it right. Governor Newsom and others in leadership are committed to have California do this work right. Do it in a way that is meaningful, impactful, as AFFH is defined by AB 686. Just the same way that we would not have had the success we did through the 2015 federal AFFH rule if we had not had the support of the Obama White House. Residential segregation has, as many of you know, caused intentionally or unintentionally, although it was often intentionally, as I must say, as Richard Rothstein reminds us very clearly. The segregation has caused enormous disparities in access to opportunities. And this is one of the major causes of white inequality in our country and in California by race and ethnicity and other factors as well. So we must ensure that where everyone lives in California, people have an increased chance to opportunity, access to safe, affordable homes for those critically unable, historically unable to live near good jobs, good transportation, and where their kids can receive quality education. Segregation and lack of access to opportunity in the housing market allowed to fester because of a whole of factors, including our nation's and California's history of outdated land use policies and patterns of investment and disinvestment by both public and private sectors. Some past practices are to blame, regrettably, and they are still continuing. They are still around us. Racially restricted covenants, redlining that plagued us in the past. We still have biased housing assessments in underserved areas, uneven mortgage lending practices, and land use policies that continue to create an uneven playing field when it comes to housing access. And it has continued in spite of 1968 Fair Housing Act, and in spite of our efforts here in the state through AB 686. Single-family zoning today replaces race-based zoning as an unwitting tool to segregate communities. Exclusionary policies, zoning policies, have made it harder for lower-income residents to access certain communities. It might surprise you, it might not, that as recently as 2017, California had nearly 400 racially and ethnically concentrated areas of poverty, an outstanding 115% increase from 2000. So between 2000 and 2017, we saw that much increase in racially and ethnically concentrated areas of poverty. So we have to correct a lot of wrongs from the past. We need to reform land use and funding policies to increase housing opportunities in high and higher resource neighborhoods, bring additional resources to traditionally under-resourced neighborhoods as well. People think, they continue to believe that the AFFH principle rely on just mobility strategies, right? Trying to incentivize low and lower income people, racial ethnic minorities to move to higher resource areas. That's not the case. This is really about a balanced approach between continue to invest in distressed communities and mobility strategies. But as we know, in recent decades, there's been an imbalance in the way that affordable housing has been created in our state. And so we are trying to correct these imbalances. And as you know, this is not just our duty here in California, it's a national priority. Hot Secretary Fudge has announced now the reinstatement of the 2015 rule. It's a critical step. There's a lot yet that is yet to be determined around the tools and guidelines that will set states and localities for success in compliance with the federal obligation to AFFH. But the reinstatement in it of itself is tremendously helpful for California because it means local jurisdictions can march in the same direction when fulfilling their duty, regardless of whether they are complying with federal or state law. And here in our state, as of January of this year, we require that all new housing elements include a series of AFFH activities and actions that you will be hearing more specifically about after my remarks. At the local level, it means communities must assess their fair housing practices, do an analysis of the relationship between sites and areas of high or low resources, and importantly, list out concrete actions to meaningfully advance fair housing. I'm very excited by the conversations that we are already seeing happening in jurisdictions around furthering fair housing, very encouraged by that public discourse that I spoke about earlier, and we are very much looking forward to receiving housing elements in the future that reflect those deliberations and that reflect the requirements of law. And as you'll see shortly, we have a lot of resources and tools at your disposal. We have a team of staff who are working hard to provide further guidance around fair housing. We have hired housing specialists to review housing elements and to provide technical assistance all along the way. I'm especially excited for communities that have this resource tool that Tyrone was referring, resource tool that is available 24/7, interactive, a literal compendium of about 60 different data sources that enable you to explore everything from fair housing enforcement to patterns of segregation and integration. You can analyze, disparities in access to opportunity at the local level, patterns of disproportionate housing needs, map out concentrated areas of poverty. And I just want to take the opportunity to say that we are extremely lucky to have Tyrone Buckley lead our fair housing work in California. Governor Newsom made an excellent choice in Tyrone. I would not be more pleased to see Tyrone's leadership advancing our fair housing goals and plans across the state. And of course, his entire team is just amazing. We're very proud of all of them. In conclusion, let me reiterate, kind of summarize sort of the 3 takeaways that I hope you take with you from these remarks. Community participation, number 1. We want to make sure the public actively participates and understands our guidelines and requirements as much as local government so that we can have a productive dialogue in localities driven in large by the community that is ultimately most affected by these plans and decisions. Second, again, committed at HCD to support local jurisdictions along the way in their quest to fulfill these requirements and comply with these portions of their housing element, with all of it, but especially speaking about AFFH. And this is, of course, not only about planning, it's also about execution. And we play a role in that as well. A new housing accountability unit at HCD that will continue to support localities as they fulfill these mandates along the way, as they implement these plans that they have established. And finally, well, it really boils down to major, in some cases, major policy shifts, uh, in localities really across the state. It's about changes in funding patterns of affordable housing programs. It's about everything that we can do and how we do. And I just hope that all this work will lead ultimately to better policies, better practices that can turn the tide and create greater choice and opportunity for these enfranchised groups in the years ahead so that we can close the inequality gaps that continue to get wider and wider, unfortunately. So very excited about this day today, the opportunity to share with you what our guidelines are, and again, make every effort to set you, community, and local jurisdictions working together, set you for success. Thank you very much for the opportunity to open this webinar, and I turn things back to you, Taylor.
Great, thank you. Appreciate that. Now we're going to get into the meat of our presentation.
Thank you very much, Gustavo and Tyrone, for your wonderful welcome and introduction. Good morning, everyone. My name is Junius Barry, and I'm a member of the Fair Housing Unit within the Housing Policy Division here at HCD. I will kick off today's Affirmatively Furthering Fair Housing Element webinar with starting off with a definition of AFFH. So Assembly Bill 686, which was passed in 2018, defines affirmatively furthering fair housing as taking meaningful actions in addition to combating discrimination that overcome patterns of segregation and foster inclusive communities that are free from barriers that restrict access to opportunity based on protected characteristics. This duty to affirmatively further fair housing extends to all of a public agency's activities and programs relating to housing and community development. Next slide, please. So specifically, these meaningful actions must aim to accomplish the following. They should address significant disparities in housing needs and in access to opportunity. They should replace segregated living patterns with truly integrated and balanced living patterns. They should transform racially and ethnically concentrated areas of poverty into areas of opportunity. And they should also foster and maintain compliance with civil rights and fair housing laws. By statute, as of January 1st, 2021, as our director mentioned, this duty to affirmatively further fair housing extends to all public agencies' activities and programs relating to housing and community development. Next slide, please. So before we dig into AB 686 and its new requirements placed on housing elements, let's briefly review some background and history of fair housing. As our director had mentioned before, in the decades preceding the civil rights movement of the 1960s, practices such as overt and covert housing discrimination through restrictive land use policies, systematic redlining, racially restrictive covenants in private land sales, biased mortgage lending practices, and patterns of investment and disinvestment restricted certain groups, particularly Black Americans and Latinos, from accessing opportunity and meaningful fair housing choice. So to address these long-standing discriminatory issues, Congress passed the Fair Housing Act, also known as the FHA, in 1968. Established shortly after the assassination of Dr. King, the FHA prohibited housing discrimination based upon race, color, religion, and national origin. The act was later amended to encompass discrimination based on sex in 1974, as well as disability and family status in 1988. The Fair Housing Act also advances the need to go beyond prohibiting discrimination in housing by creating meaningful opportunities for real housing choice through affirmatively furthering fair housing, or AFFH. Next slide, please. So these two images, of course, represent redlining maps from the 1930s through the 1950s, where sufficient housing in certain neighborhoods was systematically denied to people of color. The left illustrates the city of San Diego, while the right illustrates the Bay Area, including the cities of Oakland, Berkeley, and Alameda. Many cities, neighborhoods, and communities across our state still harbor these divided racial and ethnic enclaves carved through these maps from over 60 years ago. So some may ask, well, what is the need for AFFH? Well, despite the half-century mandate and obligation to prohibit discrimination in housing, forces driving residential segregation still persist in the present day. Racially explicit practices were eventually replaced by more subtle methods to exclude people of color from predominantly white and high-resource neighborhoods. Over time, single-family zoning emerged to replace race-based zoning as a tool for segregating communities, and exclusionary zoning practices combined with the practice of placing affordable housing in low-resource neighborhoods instead of high-resource communities continue to reinforce the spatial segregation of low-income communities and communities of color here in California. So to ameliorate these persistent issues and patterns, the California State Legislature passed AB 686 in 2018. This law establishes an independent state mandate to expand the duty of all of California's public agencies to affirmatively further fair housing. The law also expands upon existing fair housing protections outlined in the Fair Employment and Housing Act, or FEHA. Now, the bill poses two major requirements. First, it mandates all state and local public agencies to facilitate deliberate action to explicitly address, combat, and relieve disparities resulting from past patterns of segregation to foster more inclusive communities. We will expand on this in a future webinar that focuses more closely on those particular stipulations regarding public agencies here in California. The second, of course, of why we're here today, creates new requirements for housing elements due to revised on or after January 1st, 2021. All in all, AB 686 protects the requirement to affirmatively further fair housing within California state law, regardless of what future federal actions may occur. It also preserves the strong policy in HUD's affirmatively furthering fair housing rule, as published in the Federal Register in July of 2015. Now, also to note, last week, HUD announced a new interim AFFH rule, and staff here at HCD are still assessing what that means for California fair housing policy. Next slide, please. As you can see in this chart, it illustrates the new stipulations of 686. On the left is the public agency's requirement to adhere to AFFH, and on the right are the various new housing element requirements. So regarding the new requirements effective this year, there are 5 new components that are stipulated and that we will review and discuss today. These include outreach and capacity, an assessment of fair housing, or AFH, site inventory requirements, identification and prioritization of contributing factors to fair housing issues, and goals and actions and programs to address these problems. So when preparing the AFFH sections of the housing element, jurisdictions should utilize the following analyses using both qualitative and quantitative data sources, such as the ones listed on the slide. So we should look at patterns and trends, both local and regional. These include utilizing data tables, maps, and a narration to explain what's going on. Also using, of course, local data and knowledge. Other relevant factors, including the history and demographic trends within the jurisdiction, any governmental barriers or lack of action, and supplemental data sources. And the data sources that could be used to assist in the data sections of to meet the analysis requirements and sources include the US Census and ACS, regional data provided by councils of governments. This is not required, but recommended, and HCD's AFFH data viewer. This is also not required, but highly recommended. So first up, housing elements have always had a public participation requirement and have always had the mandate to reach all segments of the population. So this is not new, as existing law requires meaningful, frequent, and ongoing community participation, consultation, and coordination that is integrated with the broader stakeholder outreach and community participation process for the overall housing element. However, 686 now requires that public outreach take into account AFFH by including public input on the AFFH sections of the housing element and include a summary of fair housing outreach and capacity. So as we just discussed in the previous slide, local knowledge is an extremely important source of information when preparing the AFFH analyses. And I also want to emphasize that jurisdictions should combine regular housing element outreach with AFFH outreach. When conducting outreach, jurisdictions should consider the following: geographic barriers to participation, especially in geographically extensive jurisdictions and rural areas, in-person meetings in various locations to ensure residents from across the community have a fair opportunity to participate, meeting sites that are transit accessible and/or consider options to assist residents without vehicle access, meetings that are scheduled outside of work hours, including on evenings and weekends to facilitate a variety of participation, housing element drafts that are made available for public viewing with in-person and electronic options for review and comment, with giving ample time before submission to HCD for review. And housing element outreach should be aligned with the SB 1000, the environmental justice element, to the extent possible, given the overlapping topic areas. Some examples of key stakeholders that jurisdictions should engage with include community-based and other organizations, or CBOs, that represent protected class members, public housing authorities, housing and community development providers, lower income community members and households that include persons in protected classes, fair housing agencies, independent living centers, regional centers, homelessness service agencies, and churches and community service organizations that serve ethnic and linguistic minorities. So now I'm going to hand it over to my colleague, Marissa Prossi, who will discuss the 4 other major housing element components of AFFH.
Thank you, Junius. Hello, everyone. As Junius mentioned, I'm Marissa Prossi with the land use team within the housing policy team here at HCD. First up, I'm going to go over requirements for the assessment of fair housing piece. So the housing element now incorporates planning and analysis, which is collectively referred to as an assessment of fair housing. There are 5 required analyses, which I will go into more detail on the following slides. These are fair housing enforcement and outreach capacity, segregation and integration, disparities in access to opportunity, disproportionate housing needs, including displacement, and racially, ethnically concentrated areas of poverty. There must be an assessment for each of these 5 areas of analysis, locally and regionally, that uses all the sources and inputs my colleague Junius described earlier, like local patterns and trends, local knowledge, etc. In addition, there must be a summary of fair housing issues that stems from the findings of the assessment of fair housing. This summary of fair housing issues will be important later to inform the contributing factors, goals, and actions. Next slide, please. So the first of these areas of analysis that I'm going to go over is an assessment of fair housing enforcement and outreach capacity. Fair housing enforcement and outreach capacity relates to the ability of a locality and fair housing entities to disseminate information related to fair housing and provide outreach and education to assure community members are well aware of fair housing laws and rights. In addition, enforcement and outreach capacity includes the ability to address compliance with fair housing laws, such as investigating complaints, obtaining remedies, and engaging in fair housing testing. It should discuss any findings, lawsuits, enforcement actions, settlements, or judgments related to fair housing or civil rights. Wherever possible, the summary should include a discussion of fair housing enforcement and outreach at a geographic level appropriate to better determine any locational trends. Simply reporting information at a citywide level will not necessarily fully display patterns and impacts on protected characteristics. Next slide, please. The second is an analysis of segregation and integration patterns and trends of protected classes and by income. These protected classes are race, ethnicity, familial status, persons with disabilities, and then again, in addition to those protected classes, income. Third is an analysis of disparities in access to opportunity. While the analysis can consider indices of various access to opportunity variables, it must also independently address access to opportunity variables. For example, the analysis may evaluate total access to opportunity, high, moderate, or low, but must also individually address access to opportunity based on protected classes and income for the following variables of education, transportation, economic development and access to jobs, a healthy environment, and then any other additional relevant factors for that jurisdiction. Fourth is an analysis of disproportionate housing needs, including displacement. These include cost burden and severe cost burden, overcrowding, substandard housing, homelessness, and displacement. The displacement analysis can include different types of displacement pressures, such as investment-driven displacement, disinvestment-driven displacement, or disaster-driven displacement. Apart from the displacement analysis, there is already required analysis for these disproportionate housing needs in the housing element. What is newly required under AFFH is an analysis and understanding of patterns and trends, spatially and otherwise, of these disproportionate housing needs within the jurisdiction and compared to the region. This analysis should identify protected groups that experience higher rates of cost burden, overcrowding, homelessness, substandard housing, and displacement, and discuss any areas of a locality that experience the greatest disproportionate housing needs and any coincidence with protected groups. For example, an overcrowding analysis may need to compare needs of families with availability of housing stock with 2 and 3 bedrooms. Lastly, can we go back to slide 1? Thank you. Lastly is an analysis of racially, ethnically concentrated areas of poverty, or recaps. In addition to racially, ethnically concentrated areas of poverty, racially concentrated areas of affluence, or RCAs, should also be analyzed. Segregation is a continuum, and both sides should be considered to more fully tell the story of segregation in California communities. A couple of data considerations with this analysis: the TCAC HCD opportunity maps and HUD have recap layers that can be used. The RCA data layer is coming soon to HCD's Affirmatively Furthering Fair Housing Data Viewer. We are building off the work of scholars at the University of Minnesota's Center for Urban and Regional Affairs around racially concentrated areas of affluence and adjusting their research for the California context. Together, these 5 areas of analysis, fair housing, outreach and enforcement capacity, segregation and integration, disparities in access opportunity, disproportionate housing needs, and racially, ethnically concentrated areas of poverty make up the assessment of fair housing. Next slide, please. The third AFFH housing element requirement component relates to the site inventory. The purpose of the housing element site inventory is to identify and analyze specific land that is available and suitable to accommodate the regional housing need by income group. The site identification requirement involves not only an analysis of site capacity to accommodate the RHNA, but also an AFFH component to analyze whether the identified sites serve the purpose of replacing segregated living patterns with truly integrated and balanced living patterns, transforming racially and ethnically concentrated areas of poverty into areas of opportunity. The identification of sites should be directly informed by the assessment of fair housing analyses. One important thing to note, the site inventory AFFH analysis should not be limited to the identification of sites for lower income households, but should incorporate the jurisdiction's projected housing development at all income levels. It should assess the extent to which the site inventory further entrenches or ameliorates existing patterns of segregation and/or the exclusion of protected class members. Next slide, please. To evaluate the site inventory's consistency with AFFH, it should address the following at a regional and local level for each of the fair housing issue areas that we went over on the assessment of fair housing slide, such as segregation and integration, recaps, etc. Questions to ask. Does the site inventory improve conditions? Does it exacerbate conditions? Does it isolate a RHNA income group in concentrated areas of the jurisdiction? Was local data and knowledge considered? And any other relevant factors or questions for that jurisdiction. Based on the analysis, the element must summarize conclusions and directly identify policies and programs needed to address identifying and making adequate sites available to accommodate RHNA in a manner that affirmatively furthers fair housing. Next slide, please. This infographic from our AFFH guidance memo illustrates the point that each of the 5 AFFH housing element requirements should inform the next. The outreach, assessment of fair housing, and site inventory should inform the identification and prioritization of contributing factors to fair housing issues, and the goals and actions should stem directly from and address the contributing factors. Next slide, please. So, as stated on the previous slide, the housing element must identify contributing factors to the fair housing issue areas, and this identification should be based on all prior AFFH analyses. So what is a contributing factor? Well, it's a factor that creates, contributes to, perpetuates, or increases the severity of one or more fair housing issues. Our AFFH guidance memo provides a non-exhaustive list of examples of contributing factors, such as land use and zoning laws, community opposition, lending discrimination, lack of investment in specific neighborhoods, and many more. Next slide, please. When prioritizing contributing factors, highest priority should be given to those factors that most limit or deny fair housing choice, access to opportunity, or negatively impact fair housing or civil rights compliance. The prioritization is important. The list of contributing factors should be manageable to focus efforts around addressing the most critical issues. Think 4 to 6 contributing factors, not like 25, which is what we've seen with a few housing elements we've received so far. Lastly, the contributing factors need to be tailored to local condition. Again, bringing things back to what are the findings from that assessment of fair housing. Next slide, please. Lastly, we'll discuss the 5th component of the new AFFH housing element requirements, the goals and actions. The housing element must include a schedule of actions directly related to AFFH. As a whole, this schedule of actions must reflect the results of the AFFH analyses and directly address contributing factors. Be specific with concrete language. Words like explore, consider, and study don't cut it. Have a clear timeline with specific dates and milestones. Ongoing is usually inadequate. Have quantifiable outcomes. Specific actions with timelines and measurable or numerical objectives are essential to an effective approach. Successful outcomes will not be achievable and discernible without specificity. For example, a program to explore feasibility on an ongoing basis does little to achieve tangible results, but a commitment to rezone 50 acres to the high-density district by October 2021 has a far more likelihood of producing results. In addition, measurable or numerical objectives clarify goals and serve as a reference point for monitoring the effectiveness of programs. As part of the annual progress report, localities, through a community process, should evaluate actions for progress toward goals and objectiveness and effectiveness to make regular adjustments as necessary. In addition, the schedule of actions must have a beneficial or meaningful impact during the 8-year housing element planning period. That's ultimately the bar to overcome. Do these actions, taken together, overcome fair housing issue patterns in the jurisdiction? That also means that these actions need to go well beyond a continuation of past actions. And lastly, the jurisdiction must not take any action that is inconsistent with the obligation to affirmatively further fair housing. Next slide, please. In addition, for goals and actions, we generally see 4 action areas for AFFH. These include enhancing housing mobility strategies. Second, encouraging development of new affordable housing in high resource areas. Third, improving place-based strategies to encourage investment and revitalization, including preservation of existing affordable housing. And fourth, protecting existing residents from displacement. While having a schedule of actions with all 4 types of actions is not required, the schedule of actions must address the full scope of outreach, assessment of fair housing, site inventory, and overcome contributing factors to fair housing. So generally, a schedule of actions needs all 4 action areas to meet that requirement. We often get the question, so what is enough? Well, the number and scale of actions really depends on the severity of need demonstrated in the assessment of fair housing, site inventory, outreach, and contributing factors together. As for types of commitments, generally, a balanced and effective schedule of actions will consider and combine each of the following tools. Land use resources, things like zoning, planning documents, general plan amendments, specific plans, ordinances, and procedures. Financial resources, oftentimes investments in housing, infrastructure, community programs, etc. And third, human resources, things like outreach, education, marketing, and collaboration. Before we close out this webinar, there are a couple of things I wanted to highlight. The first is some of the common mistakes and pitfalls we've seen in housing elements received this year so far. We're still early in the process of reviewing AFFH sections of housing elements, and we know folks are adjusting to this requirement, but so far, these are some common mistakes we're seeing. The first is that jurisdictions spend a lot of time doing a high quality assessment of fair housing, but then have status quo action or program. Another is an over-reliance on a previously completed county level analysis of impediments to fair housing without narrowing down to the local context. Analysis of impediments are generally a good resource as one component, but they will never be adequate on their own for a municipality. Next is that many of the assessment of fair housing analyses fail to include regional comparisons as part of their analyses. This is important for all jurisdictions, but is particularly important for jurisdictions that are much more homogeneous. Another is that in the site inventory AFFH analyses, jurisdictions only analyze the low income sites, but don't analyze every RHNA income group. One mistake in the outreach section is jurisdictions that are not asking the public and community organizations to provide input on the AFFH pieces of the housing element. Contributing factor mistake that we're seeing. Jurisdictions don't necessarily prioritize and narrow down to 4 to 5 contributing factors, and then tie the actions to those contributing factors. Another pitfall or mistake we're seeing is that high opportunity areas can't rely on ADUs alone. This of course depends on what's going on with the AFFH analyses, but if there are entrenched patterns of socioeconomic concentrations, there is a need to go beyond ADUs to promote new housing opportunities. This is true of all jurisdictions, but so far we have seen more high opportunity jurisdictions rely on ADUs alone for AFFH. ADUs are a great and important strategy for meeting housing needs, but ADUs are typically smaller, serve a unique segment of housing needs, and do not provide sufficient opportunity to promote additional opportunities in high opportunity areas, particularly with well-formed socioeconomic concentrations like concentrated areas of affluence. And lastly, jurisdictions need to connect the dots in their analyses and shouldn't just insert data tables or statistics without explaining the significance of those data points to the larger trends. Next, as we mentioned previously, HCD has created an interactive tool called the AFFH Data Viewer to assist jurisdictions and advocates in analyzing fair housing trends. The tool can be accessed from the AFFH webpage on HCD's website and includes an interactive map with over 60 data layers. Data layers on the tool are grouped by fair housing issue area, segregation, integration, recaps, etc., and labeled as either recommended or additional. This is to show which layers we think at HCD are the most important or useful in completing an assessment of fair housing. In addition, on the data viewer, there's a how-to guide to assist folks navigate and use the AFFH data viewer. The AFFH data viewer includes functionality that allows users to print or export maps they create and insert into documents, as well as the ability to download the data itself for offline use and analysis. The data viewer is meant to be a living tool that HCD will update and add to over time. If you have suggestions, there is a feedback survey on the data viewer, or you can email the AFFH guidance inbox, which will be on the last slide of this presentation. Next slide, please. And lastly, we wanted to highlight that HCD is continuing to work on providing additional guidance and technical assistance around AFFH. This summer, we will be working on sample AFFH analyses based on different typologies of jurisdictions in California. We're continuing to update the AFFH data viewer, and we'll be adding new data layers over the summer, including the racially concentrated areas of affluence layer mentioned previously. And we are planning a few more webinars. A week from today, we'll be speaking at ABAG's Housing Element Workshop Series that they host, and we'll be talking about AFFH. And then later this summer, we're hoping to have a few more webinars centered around the AFFH data viewer and doing a demonstration of that tool, and also a webinar around the AFFH duties for all California public agencies beyond the housing element requirements. And I'm sure there will be others to come as well. Next slide, please. And that concludes our presentation. Thank you to everyone who joined us at today's Affirmatively Furthering Fair Housing HCD Guidance for Housing Elements webinar. As a reminder, today's webinar was recorded and will be available on our website in the near future. If you want to learn more after today's presentation, We encourage you to visit our website, where you can find the AFFH guidance memo, the AFFH data viewer, and other resources. If you have questions, we encourage folks to send any questions to our AFFH guidance inbox listed on this screen. Thank you for joining us today and in continuing the work of affirmatively furthering fair housing in California.